or what was it?
No.
That's choice you made. No.
I think I will.
Yeah.
Just wait another time.
Yeah, there's a few more people at the studio.
Just give him a little.
Yeah.
Right now I'm getting $40 a night for a teenager. You know, and it's kind of like, it's always a that's why I think it's been a blessing.
It's a dark time, it should be a show.
The most fun I ever had was opening Tasha's. He was jumping from bar to bar. It was Kevin Hunsaker from Green Apple. It was actually sort of, he was told by the publicist, don't. Because I think there's one little shot. He goes, well, now let's go to the studios. One was a shot. So he finally moved us back to the studios. I couldn't find him because they were against the chair. He's like, he's not going anywhere. Is there anything we can do for you? Because you don't want to actually pay him. So that happens all the time. He says, you let me smoke all week. I don't hear you stop. So I was like, okay. And he did. He smoked like the rest of us. Very elegant. They're coming.
My name is Peter. God, I know practically everybody in this room. Do I want to go through the usual spiel? I mean, you know we do a lot of books. You know we do poetry. You know most of our books are produced here. And there's a lot of great events coming up. So if you want to know what those are, you can go onto our website. But tonight is really special because it's a City Lights release. And Arcana is a very special book. And I'm actually going to let Garrett, the editor of Arcana, talk about Stephen Jonas. And he's going to be joined by several people who will be reading excerpts, talking about his life, and so on and so forth. Always a thrill to be celebrating somebody that is deserving of the attention. And Garrett, congratulations.
All right, thank you. And I thought maybe we would just, I would front load with some quick bio of our players. And then Derek and I are going to talk about the book for 15 minutes or so, and Jonas and etc. And then we're going to read some poems. So I guess I will read in order of poet appearance. Hopefully, if Brian is here. Okay, so Derek Fenner, who is a co-editor of this book with me, and our friends Joseph Torah and David Rich. Derek Fenner is an artist, an educator, a poet, and a researcher. He's got an MFA in poetry from Europa. He's a co-founder of Bootstrap Press. He's published over 40 books by poets across the country. He's published several poets that you'll be hearing from this evening. Brian Lucas is a poet, painter, and musician. He's written several books of poems, including Eclipse, Babel, Circles Matter, and Lighthouse. He's collaborated with Andrew John on the book Force Fields. His paintings were featured in the recent exhibition Dark Star, Abstraction and Cosmos. He plays in the band Dire Wolves, who put out many albums, and he was the editor of Angler Magazine and the publisher of Angler Press.
Excuse me.
Sunny Lynn Thibodeau is the author of Universal Fall Precautions as Water Sounds and Palms of Pine, as well as numerous chapbooks. She has an MA from New College of California. She's the co-founder with Michael Ballard of August Press and Blue Gallery Editions, which has published over 30 chapbooks and magazines. And then Terry Taplin, the author of the poetry collection Fragmenta. He's the inaugural Lambda Literary Fellow at St. Mary's College, poetry editor for Mary, co-editor of Based, and is the social media manager at Spect Books. He has a BA in classical languages in Greek and Latin, which is very Stephen Jonas, I feel. and is a former slam champion and recipient of the Ina Coolbrith Prize for undergraduate poetry at UC Berkeley, which I like. I like Ina Coolbrith. So. Let's see. Sophia Dolan is earned a BA from Bard College and MFA from University of Iowa, where she was an arts fellow. Appeared in a ton of journals, and she edits the chapbook press Islet. She teaches with California poets in schools, conducts generative writing workshops, and hosts occasional readings. And Michael Ballard is a poet with several full-length books to his credit, including Parish Cruise, Waifs and Strays, which is published by City Lights, Afterlives, and the Michaud Notebook. And he's also the author of the recently republished Negative Capability in the Verse of John Lears. As I said, he's co-founded August Press and Blue Gallery editions, and has published over 30 chapbooks and magazines. And he also has an MA from the College of California. So that is our crew for tonight. And we're going to begin with Derek Fenner is going to read a poem called Invocation that Jonas wrote, and he published in this magazine in 1963-ish, 1963-ish, and a magazine called Set, which was published by Garrett Lansing.
So I didn't know Stephen Jonas, but I'm pretty sure he would hate the formality of this, especially that we're not sitting in a circle in an apartment somewhere actually having discussions. But anyway, he opens the book that we put out with City Lights here, and he opens tonight through his poem Invocation. 1. O generation gone, thoroughly to seed its legislators, its heads of states, a great informal racket without instruction, incapable of recapitulation, and no distinction between subject and object suffices anymore to distinguish time and place. Long gaps appear in the contours of the language, as though a mere pencil could indicate so much grief. A language whose word of true meaning has been severely lost. 2. O lady carved in rosewood or set in alabaster, I pray you make us again, the tall grasses to bend and part before your footfall. Teach us to sin and not to sin.
All right. So why don't you, why don't we start, let me just ask you about Set for a second, because this is sort of, in a roundabout way, the beginnings that we have, the beginnings of our connection with the project through the publisher of Set. So,
how many people know of Set magazine? Few, yeah, 2 issues. In the early 60s, here's issue number 2.
Very nice.
Anyone know who published it? Garrett Lansing, yes. Garrett is as this Garrett likes to say, the keeper of the flame of Jonas. He was the person who accepted the body with Raphael di Bertola in terms of taking over the estate, taking over actually the editorship and the future publishings of Jonas, and holding on to his papers, holding on to his belongings. I don't know what more about Set. So Set happened in the early 60s, and this is like midway in the point of Jonas's life.
Yeah, and we could say it's probably worth mentioning Set's published in Gloucester, which is where Lansing was living at the time and spent much of his life. And it's very involved with Charles Olson, obviously, being
The city, not the magazine.
Yeah. But Charles Olson is in the magazine, and there's a whole scene in Gloucester that Garrett and Stephen Jonas were sort of a part of. There are other poets there like Vincent Farini, who was a buddy of Ferlinghetti's actually. I saw some good photos of them not too long ago. Who am I thinking of? Who else is in Gloucester?
So many. Yeah. Who in the room hasn't heard of Stephen Jonas? Just out of curiosity. Everyone knows Jonas?
Vaguely, very vague.
Very vaguely and vaguely. That's good. That's a good thing. It's good to start with what the room knows, right?
True.
I mean, I think, Jonas in the late 40s was studying with Sid Corman in Boston, and we know that in 48 is this period that David Rich, one of our co-editors, talks about. Pre-48, we're not quite sure. Jonas's history becomes very tricksterish. And I think that that's an important thing to reference in terms of as we start to think about the timeline of poetry and poets and how we end up in City Lights. Thinking about in the 50s is when Ed Marshall and John Wieners and Joe Dunn come into the life of Stephen Jonas. All poets we learned about in the New American Poetics. And then it gets a little bit more complicated in 1954 when at the Charles Street Meeting House he's introduced to a reading of Olson. Again, further connecting him to these prehistories, but we don't know a lot about Jonas before 48. And I guess the one thing that to me is really important, I am not a Jonas scholar, I'm a Jonas fan. I came to Jonas through an induction to moving to Boston in 2002, getting to know Garrett Lansing and Joseph Tora, who was and is the preeminent scholar of Jonas for many years. Who did the first selected poems, which is what our book is based on, and he co-edited with us this book. And then David Rich, a younger poet who came up and met Lansing in the early 2000s as well, and has begun to take the mantle from where Joe Tora left off in terms of what we actually know about Stephen Jonas. And you'll see in the postscript of this book, there's a lot we still don't know, but so much has been uncovered in terms of that.
That's worth pointing out. We have a pretty substantial biographical intro in the book that Joseph Tora wrote in the 90s. That was for the initial selected poems of Jonas. That we reused that, and then we have a postscript from Dave Rich that is sort of updating and just pursuing all the lines of investigation of what they don't know about Jonas. So circle back around, let's talk about, was it Charles Street Meeting House? Is that what?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Charles Street Meeting House, because that's the sort of galvanizing event for this group of poets in Boston. Olson comes and reads, and I believe, that's the night that Wieners and Jonas read? Is that
It's the night that Wieners introduces Jonas to Joe Dunn and others.
Yeah.
And so really a galvanizing night in terms of poetics, because then a lot of those guys took off to Black Mountain College, where Olson was. And so, but Jonas was the guy that was left behind. He said, no, I'm not going there. I'm going to stay here in Boston and do this Boston thing for a while. Which, then all of a sudden, a number of years later, 55 is when Spicer and Blazer sort of arrive from here, from the city. And they come out there and they're there for about 2.5 years or so. And that was like a big time. And I was just talking, the whole Spicer connection I'm always interested in now that I live here in the West Coast. And I was talking with Chuck Stein the other night, and he was talking about hanging out. And, he mentioned one of these old fables that we've heard about Spicer, but one that I hadn't heard in a while. And so he said that, Jonas visited him in a flat that he was renting, and he said, oh, this is great, but there was just a bed and a desk and a lamp, and there was no heat on. And he said, it's November. Like, you got to turn your heat on, man. Winter's coming. There's going to be snow. And Spicer just basically looked at him and said, snow, and left the next day for California. Again, I don't know how much of that is true. But.
Yeah, but it was a short period of time, but they're one of the significant groups of the new American poetry post-World War II, Donald Allen anthology, but it's the group that is sort of more underground than the rest of the groups. And people in that group are also like San Francisco Renaissance poets or New York School poets or what have you. But this group is sometimes called the Boston Renaissance, sometimes called the Boston Occult School, has all sorts of goofy names. But it's a real significant grouping of Joe Dunn, Jack Spicer, Robin Blazer, Stephen Jonas,
Ed Marshall.
and the sort of the period maybe you could say it ends, the Spicer and Blazer go back to San Francisco, and Garrett Lansing arrives, and Garrett's sort of a honorary member of this group, though he wasn't there for the time when they were all together.
Jonas. He had met others previously, but he meets Jonas in 1960 or thereabout, when Jonas was around 40 years old, and so he's been in and out of Gloucester at this point, and then continues to live in Gloucester or in its thereabouts for the rest of his life until a year ago, February, when he passed.
So let's talk a bit about Jonas himself. Like Derek said earlier, there's very little known about him before 1948, say, and he would have been, if he was born in 1920, as he said, so he's what?
21.
21, yeah, or
Born in 21.
no, born in 21. Yeah, so he's 27, and it's kind of a remarkable feat in and of itself to have lived in the latter half of the 20th century and people not know who the hell you are. And he really successfully hid who he was. Nobody is really sure. He told different tales. He was an inventor of stories about himself and his background, and they all seem to have some little bits of truth in them or true details in them, but they're all incompatible. He told some people he was from Georgia and he was born Rufus Jones. He told some people he was born in Plainfield, New Jersey, or New Bedford, Massachusetts. Like he had all these legends about himself, but they tended to correlate with real world details, which is a sort of fascinating thing. And what we do know is he said he had been in the army. He said in Georgia, and there's apparently no record of him actually having been in the army in Georgia. But when he meets like say Sid Corman in 1948, he's a civilian bureaucrat at a military base, and it seems that he rigged himself up a pension somehow. He made paperwork and lived off a very modest pension. He was poor and he stole some shit and went to jail for a fraud, for ripping off record club records, and but he set up a life where he didn't have to work and just could be a poet, an artist. Think about music, thinking about poetry, and the amazing thing to me is that he really got away with it. Like, you think, well, after he's dead, people will learn who this is, and no, I mean, he's as mysterious as like Robert Johnson or somebody like that. He's not, he's off the radar. So what we have is what he told us and what he wrote.
I mean, I think Joe Torra successfully calls this his succession of masks, in terms of being sort of a trickster kind of character, but also in a way of entering the world in a place where he didn't have to stay local. He could kind of be anything he wanted and remake himself. In fact, in a notebook from 1968, one of the things that Dave Rich, an incredible piece, the postscript is really the opening of an idea about anti-biography of Jonas and how he actually created this idea of an anti-biography and went against that. He actually finds in a notebook from 68 where Stephen references himself as quote, Stephen Jonas Manuel Edward Pereira y Santos. And so tying in many of these names that he's been throwing along all the way, and all of these things sort of connect. He even, sorts to go into the Mashpee Wampanoag heritage of Jonas, and possibly that he was an Indian, and he ties into the notebooks were this magical place of him working things out, both biographically and then poetically. And so he's keeping track of things in these notebooks, and there's over 30 notebooks that'll be in the papers of Garrett Lansing at Beinecke, of Jonas in the Jonas archive. Over 30 notebooks that have really only been seen by a handful of people.
And they're full.
And they're full. They're full of things like reading lists. They, you know, one of the things that we saw when we were at Garrett's house a couple years ago was that they were also like calling cards. It was like his house was a constant meeting place. People were always crashing there. And so the notebook would lay open on the desk, and there would be notes from previous people like, oh, hey, stopped in to see you, you weren't home. Even to the last note he took, which was like, don't leave me alone, I don't feel very safe. All these things were sort of, this notebook was just, you know, John Wieners was writing, and all these people that, you know, were writing in it, because it was just sort of, that's how we, you know, we didn't have these pocket panopticons, we didn't have text messages, we didn't have these ways of being connected to each other. We had to be connected through the places where we knew we would see each other, or know where we could see someone. And so, you know, that was, like, I think, a big part of it for me that really excited me. So when I got to Boston in 2002, shortly after John Wieners passed, I immediately met up with Garrett Lansing and Joe Torre, and immediately was indoctrinated into this beauty of Jonas, a poet I hadn't. Even though I had studied at Naropa, they weren't teaching Jonas. They might have thrown some Wieners our way, and we might have found our way to some other things, but, you know, Jonas, this idea of somebody, you know, Olson was definitely taught, but like this idea of breath and jazz, you know, Jonas was taking to these other levels.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I was in Joe Torre's basement and he starts reading aloud from Exercises for Ear at this just little party he threw for a few people, and you know, those of us in the room that didn't know of this were just like all of a sudden immediately taken, like, who is this guy? We have to meet him. Oh no, you know, he passed in 1970. So, you know, even then, so.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, a lot of what you just said in terms of the jazz poetry is very interesting. There's a lot of you know, he uses a lot of jazz, you know, sort of jazz or beat type of stylings, and you know, and is composing frequently to music, you know, different solos. Apparently memorized certain solos of different horn players, but he mixes it with all sorts. You know, he's very interested in like Elizabethan type of language. He's very interested in you know, classical poetry, like Greek poetry, seemingly more than Latin, and interested in like Chinese poetry. You know, he does a lot of imitations or versions of like a Tu-Fu poem, something of that nature. So yeah, he's an extraordinary poet in terms of, he's a unique flavor in what's going on in post within the New American Hope, you know. But
he definitely, I mean, again, I talk about him as if I knew him, but I didn't. And even the people that I knew, only one of them knew him. And so, you know, even I was talking with Chuck Stein, as I said the other night, and like just even getting Chuck's semblance, you know, I asked him, what were those magical evenings like? Because he used to have these magical evenings, which were inspired from Spicer's magic evenings. And I said, what were those like? And you know, he said, that was 50 years ago. He's like, you're asking me to remember what I can remember. He's like, I don't know if what I'm actually telling you is what I remember or what I remember remembering. He's like, it's been so long. He's like, but I'm willing to talk with you and to talk about, you know, Jonas holding forth in these evenings and you know, just this idea of sort of, he was really open to all of these things. And because he was so open, and we haven't talked about things like his drug addiction, his mental health, all of these things that played into sort of, you know, Dave Rich talks about this in his postface. He was unable to filter the toxins of what he was taking in. Not just the toxins of the times, with racism, with white supremacy, with all of these things that were going on in the world, but also just the toxins of what was cycling through his body how it was coming out through his poetry and what all of that meant. But he still had this innate drive to push and to put things out. And so we're left with all of that. And you know, we can certainly try to make blames on where it comes from, but it doesn't matter. It was his. I don't know if there's other things.
Yeah, well, one thing I've been thinking about that had left my head, unfortunately, earlier, it's worth pointing out too that he's very influential on Spicer and Wieners, and you know they're really considered like compared to like even 10 years ago, they're really their importance has finally dawned on the world, and you know, but people really don't know about Jonas, and they took a lot of you know, ideas from knowing him, and Spicer in particular. You know, Spicer's kind of known for the serial poem, and he's really getting it from Jonas. You know, and he writes his first serial poem the minute he gets back to San Francisco, and you know, there's a section of it is dedicated to Jonas, and like so Jonas really like turned Spicer's head around, and so.
And he got it from Pound and from Olson, and you know, so it's this longer form that sort of existed that he just really was attracted to, and both his exercises for ear and then orgasms, which turned into dominations much later. You know, definitely was a cycle for something that then I think inspired a lot of people.
Yeah, and you know, he had a lot of problems. Derek alluded to. He was a drug addict. What's that?
What was out at the time? I mean, literally, he was
whatever he could get his hands on. And I don't even know what the hell. He died of an overdose of something. I don't even know what the hell it is.
It was an opioid that's no longer in use.
Yeah.
So it's no longer available. It was something that was common at the time. I mean, if you read David Rattray's the opening essay to How I Became One of the Invisible, I don't know if I got the title right, but it's this whole piece about how when he first met Jonas, you know, Jonas shows up, it's this guy he's meeting, and you know, all of a sudden they've got $10 between them, and you know, they give Jonas $5, and he's supposed to go and score food, and they're going to go score drugs with the other $5, and then how somehow this $5 he comes back not with food and with water and with drink, but he comes back with this book. and it's this book that becomes the most important thing of the evening, and the rest of them realize, well, we're not going to eat, all we're going to have is this book to eat, so let's enjoy this book. So that, you know, there's a lot of stories like that too, and you know, certainly he died of an overdose. So.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, he's an interesting poet because he hasn't really yet had much impact on black poetry because he was writing in a white milieu, like mostly white gay milieu of poets, and he seemed to have ambivalence about you know, part of his whole identity proliferation was he has a certain ambivalence about his African Americanness, and that he would claim to be Portuguese sometimes,
and the Portuguese came from possibly being Cabo Verdean, which was a Portuguese colony, you know, off of West Africa, in Massachusetts too, and you know, I think that you know, I think it's important, and I'm not giving up anything here. But the last little paragraph of, so spoiler alert, but the last paragraph of David Rich's essay I think is worth at least the first part of it repeating. Because this is sort of, you know, so David, since 2012, has been doing this research on let's figure out exactly who Stephen Jonas was. And he lays out in this, you know, 5 or 6 pages, all the steps he took to try to figure this out. And he took every step one could possibly take. And he says, Stephen Jonas evaded society's definitions throughout his life, sly and mercurial to the last. Whether he made the long trek north from Georgia to New Jersey as part of the Great Migration, or was ripped from his Catholic, Cabo Verdean, or Puerto Rican culture, placed with Protestant whites, whether he was a practicing Quaker or Christian Scientist, whether he was Jones or Jonas or Santos, he was a poet. And the Boston demimonde of poets, addicts, and scammers came to be the only consistent human support in his life besides bureaucracies and asylums. And so really just, here's this person who's going through all of this in such a tumultuous times, as we can all sort of attest to what we're in now, and sort of how he was making sense of who he was and where he comes from. And I think that it's a story of now as much as it's a story of then, and maybe it's something that we've lost or refound, but I think it's something that we're just finding is happening over and over again and again.
Yeah, no, I do think this is a story of people who we relate to now, and I feel like he will have some more play than he had, say, last edition was like 25 years ago. So, but I think that's a pretty good overview. Are people happy with that? Or if anyone's got a question, otherwise we can get down to the business of poetry. What's up, Pat?
I was just interested about Vincent Farini, and
Yeah.
it was in my head reading through the book, and then you brought up Farini, and so is there any connection at all between Farini and Jonas, or what was happening in Boston at that time? I'm just curious if you guys ever picked up anything.
I asked Chuck
papers
2 days ago. I asked Chuck, would Olson have ever gone down? No, Olson would not have left Gloucester at that point. I asked about Farini, but Chuck's basically was just like, I never saw Farini at the Magic Evenings, but this was '69, so this was, who knows? Certainly he must have known of Farini. He knew everyone else involved, and Jonas traveled around. It's not like he just stayed in the city of Boston. So
did you ever hear tales about him going up to Gloucester or anything?
Yes, he definitely went up to Gloucester. In fact, he definitely in '69 visited Chuck in Gloucester and came to his house, because that's the one of the things Chuck could remember with clarity was the time that Jonas came to his house, and they talked about that. They talked about how, because he died just a month after Olson in 1970s. So '69 was sort of this, and that was sort of the summer. I forget which summer. So '69 was this great summer in terms of what was happening with the Magic Evenings, and then 10 years prior to that was this summer where Blazer and all these guys lived blocks from each other in Boston. So
Cool. Okay. Do you want to start and read?
There's a question up there.
Please.
What was the context for the line about succession of masks?
So that Joe Torra, he talks about this in the introduction, and this is the introduction that he writes for the Talisman selected poems that came out in '94. I think I have that year right, I don't know.
Yeah.
Succession of masks just being this succession of faces that Jonas would put on. That Jonas, depending on circumstance, his story would sort of shift, and you could never quite tell, and he would just sort of change these masks of, oh no, I'm Portuguese, oh no, I'm this, oh no, I'm Rufus Jones from Georgia, oh no, I grew up in the South Shore, so it's just sort of this succession of identities in a way that Jonas would constantly put on, and you can even see this in the notebooks, and I think that's what Joe is talking about, is specifically in the notebooks you can see him working these things out. Names changed, period, and a list of names that he's changed. So sort of working out, keeping in his own head, kind of this idea of what have I already said, what haven't I said?
Kind of a Pete Traven issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's not like this is the cops; these are his friends. And and he still was very concerned about what he was putting forth to different people, and told different people different things. Anyone else, or yeah. So do you want to start?
Yeah, so I'm just going to read a couple poems, but I thought I would start. I think Garrett Lansing's poem in memory of Jonas, even though I just learned from Jim Dunn today, who is a friend of Garrett's, that Garrett always thought of this poem as super sentimental, too sentimental. But we all love it, and we've always loved it, and actually the salad bowl is still sitting in Garrett Lansing's house in Gloucester. Even though the books took flight a month ago, 30,000 books are now off into the world to find new homes. The salad bowl remains with the keeper of the house, John Giglio, and from what I've heard, it's going to be given to Joe Torra, so I hope that comes true. So this is called Amazing Grace in a Salad Bowl, in memory of Stephen Jonas by Garrett Lansing. And of the dead, the dear gone new into ancient halls, the melody lingers on. A favorite quote of his melodies do. In no repair on earth for broken nerves, worn out heads, the injuries the sensitives self-inflict. The God of this world treads on brains like grapes. In the wine press, what can we do but sing if we are men at all? 1. You are gone, Esteban, and your big brown body just isn't there to hands you chose. Hotel Madison men's rooms boy. Hotel Madison men's room boys. Weird high objects of your unearthly love. Dumb credit card thieves, boosters, drunks, the last junk of the world. They shift without you on the esplanade, and I shift without you like your other friends who have their own memories of your kindness, cooking, talk, your body that changed and changed too. I have a salad bowl, unpolished wood. I cherish as of you best memory, the courtesy and purity of greens, lemon juice, and olive oil. You wove a fabric beyond your words, ideas I sometimes felt were crazy, a coat of hospitality, embracing wine and merriment of Boston dawn, the place of time you loved. 3. Boston you were to me after I left New York, hub of haven, would pile and exhausted from nights of pleasure to hear your morning chatter, drink coffee, sometimes beer or wine. You knew the Boston crevices, their histories, the rats and marketplace, how to get electric free, clothes, hi-fi parts, good affabilities. 4. Du musst dein Leben ändern, Rilke wrote, and how poesy transforms we disputed oft, not denying that it does, it sure does. Now sunset fading, I wonder what the panoply of spring was worth to all of us. The price of all that agony, the sky on fire, boys moving through the blood, the witless loves, the loved ejaculations, and again the upturned wild faces. For you, a reason found in madness, a cap on mere existence. You denied the ecstasy I claimed, said tricks were only tricks, which I in turn denied. But you and I together knew, bright words hanging on the boughs of dawn, amazing grace. So just 3 Jonas poems for me, short ones, all around sort of music. Ornithic scene. These pigeons, when no bread is thrown to them, repair to this, half dead from the top. A lanthus tree, discussing among themselves those things pigeons are concerned to. Avant-garde fare, from Paris mainly, a rehashed up to us at home decades later. Aviary lore, confronting the new music, mostly from the below. Living branches full of sparrows, pulling off sit-ins, as it were, with strident catcalls to the new Philistines, the all of which is to send the cats against the brick wall, beyond whose rhetoric they may not go. One of 3 musicians. The first time I heard Ornette Coleman, I thought about Picasso's 3 musicians, with their neoclassical instruments, cigar boxes with soft line strings drawn across barrel staves, tin cans thrown or kicked in Congo Square. These fakers with jawbone percussions out of dead horses and instruments from the child's hand. They reproduced the spears, the screams, the outburst of dark religious exorcisms. These are not the shoed peasant feet out of Bruegel's painting, the Kermesse. These are bare black feet pounding delta clay, the wire and steel singing over broken barrel staves, saying a theater is any place free associates come to play. And finally, Back of Town Blues. There is a bourgeois dullness that settles plumb blank upon the blobs of American cities. It is a dullness of locality, and to each city, its own brand of ennui. I have felt it. So must have you. The traffic of a thoroughfare moves left to right and right to left. Thusly, the faces and windows move likewise. Or they loiter about stoops or congregate at the corners' intersections, anticipating violence. What else, save read a book on the index or see a controversial movie, dead though they move like an Egyptian mummy whose guts have been exerted? I tell you, there is a bourgeois dullness that settles plumb blank upon the blobs of American cities.
All right, next we have Brian Lucas.
Hi, thanks for coming, Stephen Jonas. I discovered him about maybe, 25 years ago.
Oh, yeah, show them the old book.
Oh yeah, so this is the selected poems that came out in 1994. I think it's like $80 on Amazon, but I got a copy here for you for like $100. I'll autograph it for you. But yeah, I don't know how I discovered Stephen Jonas, but yeah, I was like in my mid-20s at the time, and I have to confess, and I think Stephen Jonas would like this story, is I was briefly living in New York and I found one of his books. I think it was Orgasms, is that right? With the Basil King cover?
Is that Transmutations?
Transmutations, thank you. And in a bookstore, and I was like, well, I can't afford $40, so I ran out the door with it. But that was like 20 years ago. So I don't do those things anymore. So I'm going to just read two poems. Exercises for Ear. This is number 112. Your little world surrounded with newsprint, maintained in orbit via artificial improvisation. A pink, inoculated soul peeks out into the sanitary landscape where abstract cars fart carbon sums to chase the split-personed artist through and under sluice jazz ways and rapid transit screaming, don't just take these words from me. I'm kind of hearkening back to the mentions of Jack Spicer earlier. I think Manroot published this, right? So a friend of mine, Richard Taggett, had a press called Manroot Press back in the early 70s, which was a really important press in terms of like poetry, queer poetry and politics, and he actually published a chapbook of Stephen Jonas's, and I think this is in it, I'm probably wrong, but it doesn't matter. Morphogenesis being a conventionalization of morphemes of Jack Spicer. Clearly outlined, men and things stand out in a realm where everything is visible. No contour is blurred. Here is a device of essential explanation, retarding the foot, the going back and forth. It is the quiet existence of things according to their natures. Nor are we robbed of our poetic natures. The effect is precisely that they describe, what is brought to light in perfect fullness in that a continuous rhythmic procession of phenomena passes by in cinematic exhibition. Fragmentary or half illuminated, we glimpse the pathos of heretofore unplumed depths, the which once long ago a bore enlarged into parentheses, voluminous and syntactical. So that God, its three selves, given quietly, disentangles himself from a syntactical subordination to the word no longer made flesh, And you just pick up on like Stephen Jonas's like readings in Gnosticism, which is really apparent in this. About here, I am fully aware that this is not the world of awakeness. The old woman now touches it, equally free, the new present, which continues unchallenged until, with verse, the law, once again, to break the scene off. All content is arranged with the end in sight, with the end in view. I is the recollection which awaken in future dream tenses, so that the possibility of connections before and after no longer exists. It is an old story made the exclusive present. So it was, after these things, he said, "Behold, here I am. Seaweed and sea scum, bedringled and bedraggled, the holy transformed. It is the voice of the line coming from that dark place to foreshadow in a foreground our eyes are not yet accustomed to. These sentences about whose syntactical connections we are told nothing. It is the mysterious wary. Therein lies its motivation, the entire process in vacuo. No place is meant to indicate clearly. The time is always late in the evening. It is the early morning. That is the wordless specter. We wrestle a skin diver in a room full of blood. The place we shall come to know is clearly stated in certain musical statements of horns upending. I take it that Jack Spicer's phonemes carry the printed circuitry that upon utterance reproduces the visual impression. The place of the act is exactly stated. It is a scene characterized apart from person or story. Neither pleasant or unpleasant is all we are told, and is seldom, if ever, illuminated in old script. Crabbed ambiguity of lost connections, the contrary indicates the absolute existence. Suspense is the present bordering on the future. The poet robs us of our emotions. We are left fish bones wrangling by seaboard. This is the two used by direct discourse. Thought, indication, bears its motives. We are still, but not free of guilt. When the fever passes, we contrive to give up the host. God is an interruption of heavy silence. The two went together. Everything you see remains unstressed. The two equally ancient in the foreground, the brushstrokes, pockmarks, the lacuna of Rodin. What lies between light spaces undefined? This detail of canvas is undisclosed silence, going back and forth, leaves an impression. So instantly we awaken. This is the first day of our lives, 1964 to 67. Thanks. And thanks to City Life for publishing Arcana. It's an absolute triumph.
Next we have Sunny Lynn Thibodeau. Oh, okay.
I hope I can make it through that. I'm gonna just read one little short poem that's in 3 short parts. But I wanted to start with a paragraph from Joseph Torres' intro, and this goes back to 94, not collection that he put out. And this taps on what they were talking about. Jonas is one of the great jazz voices in American poetry. He wrote with an improviser sensibility. His spontaneity, starts, stops, inflections are unique. He adopted Williams, that's William Carlos Williams' revolution of the line and tuned an idiom to his own jazz ear. He frequently read poetry out loud, including Pound, over jazz. His letters and notebooks are filled with music-related references, which is what you guys were talking about. And then he goes on to quote a letter from 1961 to Sid Corman, one of the things in trying to choose what to read, I was like, I'm from New Orleans. I worked really hard to lose my New Orleans accent and speak in a way that my family was like, what are you doing? I want to pronounce and enunciate in a different way. So reading Jonas, I was like, oh, how do I honor his Boston accent? I don't know if I can, but I will try. But he said this to Sid, and I thought this is everything. Knowledge and the not just ain't my forte. You had better realize now, once and for all, that me and the correct way just don't make it. When I write listening for the sound of the word, and I come as close to the spelling of it as spelling will permit me. Usually that is not close enough. What I'm trying here to get over to you, Sid, is that I am a poet, I hope so, drunk with the music of language. Hell, man, it's all I can do to get the sounds down, let alone wrestle the fucking dictionary. And so this is 3 dance moves for you. 1. The smile that curved so once about the lips, lifted at the corners and yawned into the spaces left for words that never come or hides like the subtle ivy. Its tentacles beneath a green shade looking out solicits no applause. Nor in this common light have we fared better. Most unhappy lot, made notoriously reasonable, chance and circumstance turns all to cold metallic purpose, setting no sights to move or to dance the image, dismantled all the machinery, departed, leaving the scene, to model in abstractions, passions too powerful to be believed, or if believed, too long endured. In the age of frescoes, he married the classic image, adding to it his own outraged agonies, depending from the lower limb of some Paduan master. The vulture surveys almost the entire canvas, so one thinks of Charles' husband floating past, caught up in a swirl of past regrets. It is an audacious willingness to experience. It's November 1961.
Thank you. All right, our next reader is Terry Chaplin.
Thanks to City Lights, thanks Garrett and Sophia for inviting me and thinking of me. This is actually my initiation for Jonas, so I feel it's kind of a bit of a hermetic guidance for me to be here. I'm going to read 2 poems. This is Gloucester. Impressions for J.W. III. As to a trumpet blast, reawakened, I returned to places once visited. Old names, streets, familiar sights revive of the instant. Thus are we judged by former knowledge, arising now, fresh bloomed, from beneath the past tense of the subjective cemetery, writing, still writing back, the subjective omnibus, returning from Manchester when Mrs. Butler was alive, God rest her, with Richard, my old etc., to Oak Street, Gloucester, a fine old house as his grandfather left it, clapboard, Queen Anne, Federalist, door brass as the eagle spread, colonial ladder backs, the floor 8 or more inches wide, the boards were several generations on the lapped, and with horror of horrors concealed in every closet. His mother, a fit of starts and stops, and was shocked that I wanted to go over to East Gloucester's jazz at Storyville, moved to North Shore of the summer, but my Dickie suggested instead we go up to see how Our Lady was doing. Our Lady, to cue you, the signal to get the old man's car keys and hightail it over to Rockport with the ritual of the lightly mystical query of Los Abandonados, and on weekends, nearly half of Harvard's Divinity School, and it is said that Rockport's a dry town. There were other moments too, as when the blessing of the fleet and she goes down to the sea, rose and anemone petals trail out to sunset, red in the afterglow. There was a studio in Pigeon Cove where Eleanor, divine name, declaimed me the 4 quartets. I was brought to my knees, and so it was that I declared for poetry. Also, there was the matter of the old Salzburger, Old Salt in Gloucester Harbor, and the burgomaster we need not go into, but the cruise about the harbor of a Sunday, and the summer houses nestled in the cliffs of Annisquam stay with me. There was more, much more, though mostly some muse, memory. She is also mother of the muse, so that the judgment that might be finality is no more than her flowers reawakened to delect us, my friend. Shall we partake further of that mortal odor? So you might recognize some familiar lines, but I'm going to read a proposition for Ed Marshall. The true church depends upon the ether. There are gods in the solemn air. It is an triangular affair. The altar, 2 stones support a third, a lintel beam. There is no roof, for here the sun is worshipped, and by night the moon, with remembered light, comforts the howl of worshippers and other crawling lusts. Nor have we fared better in this common light that made notoriously reasonable this most unhappy lot. Chance and circumstance turns all to stone, and metallic purpose sets no sights to move or images to dance in streets that machinery dismantled, departing, have left the scene to abstractions of passions too powerful to be believed, or, if believed, too long endured. What is partaken is broken into fragments without connection. Between the acts, things fall apart. A non-que prevails. The center does not hold. There is no return. What has been surrendered cannot be reclaimed. The magic word has been lost, or if recalled, the parched tongue will not articulate. Terror issues from the deep. This is the first day, and nothing is to be done. For at the time I had not form. The wolf dog hayed at the foot of the tower, lacking the living voice. 1961. Thank you.
Our next reader is Sophia Dahl.
I was sitting there going, am I as tall as Terry? Will I be? I won't. I think we're very lucky to read these poems in a room where we can see someone's laundry drying and hear the party someone is having. A revel for John Fusco. Delirious as though of barbitures I had drunk, and a strange passion swelling blood into my heart from my mind, runs the poem upon dithyrambic feet lustily. I cry out in a poem to you, my sweet will be 20 on Sunday next. Upon such feet of shaggy measure, I come privily, permitting it pleases you, a scene by Faromar, prostrate to whisper to you beneath a hedge, as above and about hover nymphs, naiads, and other demi-beasts of sorts, even to the hushed wings of pretty doves, fluttering and cherubs, caroling. My amours, repeat, my sweet will be 20 on Sunday next. Now in middle March, when the wind is intemperate still, I muster what devices the imagination prompts me to. A painter, these conceits are not unfamiliar to you, so I need not make apologies for a decor, classic and eclectic, which in my frenzy I arranged, hoping therewith to ensnare your fancy, sweet. It is a poet's madness, driving him willy-nilly, howbeit to his own destruction, masked or metamorphosed into some wondrous animal guise, centaur, unicorn, or fawn. Repeat, my sweet will be 20 on Sunday next. So even to the birds whose calls the ancients invoked and unabashedly cooed their canciones, to wit a woo, all of it I bring again, my sweet, to you in the springtime of the poem. Where else, when spray begins to springeth, could I come in my folly, bearing you in some small measure such snatches purloined as I have of that antique liturgy? Repeat, my sweet will be 20 on Sunday next. The phrase is reprieve reverberates within my skull, as I say in my high passion, may he not also love me too? Repeat, my sweet will be 20 on Sunday next. And I've come to sing to you. It's 1961. And that was on page 100. I see you people reading. This is on page 113. Love the poem, the sea, and other pieces examined by me. Not so much for receiving stolen goods as for placing the junk, dead as the world, before the senses. In such times one is put upon within, you know how we squeeze today for meaning. The few words we have left to us. Here in a word is the sea before me. But the sea cannot be squeezed. So I sit as close to it, as close as safe. The sea speaks if speech be sound, but speech is not sound, so turns from meaning to the poem. If the sea is anything, it is deep in silence, below and beyond a few pebbles, chatter thrown against sand. Thalassa, the Greek reminds us, but the Greeks are profound and too elude us, and no one likes to be found out. In a dead world, as a matter of course, California becomes the sun symbol. I supposed you born there, so in thought I leap, thinking to rush up gladly to greet you, just as would any another creeping thing along Washington Street. The stores will close in an hour. The sparrows are hopping about the grass by to say it's green, I suppose, and alive with parasites I do not see. Being birds, these things do interest her, they do not. They are still birds. St. Francis, indeed, you were a fool. For had not you, we would all of us go screaming mad down the street, so serious we are come to take ourselves. Love, we say, but the flower we see arose edges by degrees, the secret locked tight within the unfolded bud. The hedge that is the sea defines its limits. In life, love, that switchblade belly thrust, be quick. Say what you will, death is slowly withdrawing the blade of life. Also love. If in life I am ever in love, I am consumed. Choice? I shall, with doubt, bloom in my season, and bloomed, be blown out to sea, or up for the other gas, heaven, that is to come, in the Hollywood of the end. We have before tasted those ecstasies of extreme unction, so let's you and me keep it clean and simple, complexity not to be involved. Poem is the child's ear, and love is naked and unashamed to cry that it is not fondled. This reminds me that as the sea cries, its cry is merely a surface noise. Its secret is much deeper, but men are no longer interested in the sea of their minds. They have visions of other worlds, accurately numbered. They visit them daily in papers, and in the meantime plan, within a decade, to shoot the moon. Good. As it is, a dead issue, in this at least they show foresight. Let them get out of the world, whatever means they may. Not by any long shot is the sea dismissed from the mind. For a time the sea defines the mind's periphery. But after a time, a sea is all around you and over their worlds. When you speak of B. Donahue, I think always the Irish Sea. His horses are also the seas, though we do bet are hard to come by resources of life. The sea takes us, horse and rider. In every race, it must be thus, and so tragedy enters our lives. Not so much B. Donahue as the Greek, who also had notions of other worlds, but continued to live by the sea as their language, which I have had of records attest. Today's science fiction, yes, but the real sea, throwing hints as pieces of driftwood, the twisted gray remains burn or preserve as what knots. They give warmth or they give chill. Mike, I've seen pieces of driftwood, too. So twisted together, you and I would be hard put to extricate. How can I so subject our two lives to so trivial a thing? A twisted freak thrown together in the sea of unconcern to be discarded in some obscure beachhead of our world. It is fat summer here, and ducks quack because of it. The birds will no longer come to investigate the grass. They work by signals as we pour over our signs for some parasite of meaning. It has been a lean season for you and me. I did not intend a serious poem, but the poem has a will all its own. I am a poor vehicle, a transport in summer were I to be discarded also in the season of decline. Love, oh, self-willed love, though unworthy, remember me kindly at the hour of decline. Know that I sacrificed all to say nothing. Hereafter, it will be stark winter. Every sign indicates it. In the long night, there will be time enough to think what pigs we have made of ourselves.
Mr. Markabell.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Derek Finner, Gary Caples, Joseph Tora, Dave Rich, Lane, everyone at City Lights for putting out the Jonas book, which we've apparently been waiting for since I was 17, since the last issue came out. Thanks, Joe. Dating myself here. I'm going to read just a couple of poems to end it off. And is this cool? On the way to work this morning, I was thinking about them both, so I just kind of jotted this down real quick and I'll read the poems.
Microphone.
Microphone?
Microphone.
I've heard that one before.
No.
No, I know, this is fine. I know. I'm waiting for Jonas outside. He's been hanging out with us all night. Slightly over 2 decades ago, when I first moved here to San Francisco, I met the poet Stephen Jonas through the poet John Wieners. I met them both on the page, which is about as real life as, to me, as actual real life is. Sometimes more, never less. At that time, I also met the poet Garrett Lansing. I met him on the page first too. Then I wrote him letters like I did John, and realized that all three were friends. Fast forward years later, and through friends, I got to meet Garrett in person. I had realized not too long before that if I listened close enough, the invitation to join their table was always there, given our common lineage of poetry. And physically present or not, we could all play musical chairs, and the conversation would be endless. So that said, I'm going to read John's introduction to Stephen's book, Transmutations, and then read a poem dedicated to John from Stephen. They're both a year apart, but I like the fact that they get to, and that's what you get to do when you dedicate poems or whatever. You're just having a conversation with your friends, and you're talking with one another. I mean, I love the fact that John had the occasion to write a preface, and he let a poem do the work instead of being like, oh, I have to write a preface. It's like, well, let's just let the poem be the occasion and arrive as is. And they're like a year apart, so I think that's really cool. This is my bookmark. Death Songs Questions. This is from the Gleason Library at USF, courtesy of Patrick James Lerman. As preface to Transmutations. How long ago, Steve, it was we walked along Arlington Street, throwing words to wind, before junk, before jail. We moved to four corners of the world. You lived on Grove Street and wrote poems to the Navy, to Marshall, to Boston Common. A simple life, frantic come down. I look now at a backyard in San Francisco, Easter Sunday organ music through the room below. Gone our lovers, gone Arlington, Beacon, and Charles Streets, March 29th, 1959. 6 months in Danvers. How can the poem show in your eyes in those dark cells? Bang, Arlington Street comes down with a clump. Oh, for a blade of grass. Oh, for a room with rent paid. Oh, for a roof. I see before me the cobblestones in camera, Dana and you and the sun ducking out of the lens. You cannot move faster than the shudder of my mind. Elms bend over the street and form an arch we walk under, sad priest in the 20th century. We begin the second half together, chalked our words on red brick and left them for the rain. It is not kind, nor time, nor memory the mother, a thing of barbs and needles. The street is long. It runs to ends of the earth. We are still on it, but we cannot see or hear the other. What traffic drowns out all our notes. 1959. This is Stephen for John Wieners, January 6, 1960. Who will come after you singing as well? Here the music breaks as you. Later we must take that again, make it reprieve. Sound, like a black iris by Klein, a broken telephone, old kind with horizontals and forked receiver for hooks. To receive the click point, it rings, but it is not here for thee. Head full of old tunes with a bad connection. Fix? Why, hell no. Suffer there for me to suffer. What? If this music hits you, back we go straight to, but hell, that is too. With me it's the same old wrong number. Up. Man said broilers? We got audience, one old measure, some last year's Ferlinghetti and a Corman review, Achilles' fame rummaging through. I heard from Corman and remembered you then. The old cat connected and laid it on me, man. I flipped. The upshot was your old lady on the phone, blaming Dana. When, man, it's the beads. Oh, stop up the drain, and the access to remorse too. There is no loss of whiteness in your hostility, be it Wintley or Irvington. Rooms they all have, spaces between. The fucking wallpaper rhymes. 1960.
All right, thank you, Michael. I'll just let one rip here. This is called Green. As the day you were born, without leaves, without stripped, barely distinguishable from other heathen branches, baptized by understanding, the overfalling showers falling affectionately upon birches, boughs of old family trees are sentimental attachments to roots, joined in soil swollen clusters of sublimation, like lines hidden, never washed publicly, but bathed rumors in clothes closets, behind doors of juries, locked in to keep out the public like rain endlessly falling in January, when hell, even the yellow is an orange. Hidden in trees, bathed in a smog-soaked landscape, endlessly falling and rising. So, thank you very much.
I'm sorry, but Jonas never got a chance to read it, City Lights, so will you guys just let him read for a minute in like 40 seconds? Will that be all right? So this is Brotherhood and All That Bad Air by Stephen Jonas, recorded at Harvard, if it works.
Brotherhood and all that bad air. Theology, which has never been my bet, is nonetheless not odious to me, for I feel an affinity with these non-essential, unexploited who congregate at this intersection in the south end of the city. They are my own flesh and blood. Everything they pass is communion, whether it be the tobacco sack or a pint of cheap muscatel they drink. Below their backs at the roadbeds of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railway, inviting you to emigrate out to California, say, to San Francisco now, where the writers and related sister arts assemble, pretending a Parnassus.
I gotta say, Georgia, my ass. He sounds like he's from Burlington. Like that's a real Massachusetts accent. It's pretty amazing. Well, I want to thank you all for coming. It's just really important to us to be able to bring a poet back like Jonas, who has kind of been, just hasn't been available. And I thank City Lights for allowing it to happen, and thank you all for coming and checking it out.